All right, I'm Professor Van Norden, and this is our course on Neo-Confucianism and Chinese Buddhism. And today we're talking about Zen practice. Now, the music I was playing while you were virtually getting seated was the original Kung Fu Fighting by Carl Douglas. And you're probably wondering, why is my professor playing this when we're studying something very serious, which is the development of Zen doctrine and practice, which is originally Chan doctrine and practice in China. There is a reason, and there's a reason why our opening slide has a picture of the famous martial artist Bruce Lee. We'll get to that in section 6 of today's lecture. But the first thing I want to talk about is why it makes a difference whether you're a metaphysical dualist or a monist. Metaphysics, again, ask questions like, what are the most fundamental kinds of things that exist, and how are those things related to one another? A monist is someone who thinks that ultimately there's only one thing that exists. That one thing can manifest itself in a variety of different ways. It can have plural aspects, but in reality, there's just, in some sense, one thing that exists. A dualist is someone who thinks there are fundamentally two different kinds of things that exist. And I've said this before, but I'll say it again here. You might think that metaphysics is this really abstract topic that has nothing to do with your real life. But the reality is that you're a metaphysician whether you know it or not. You have metaphysical views, and those metaphysical views will have implications for ethics. So the first thing I want to talk about is what are some of the implications of dualism versus monism, because Chan or Zen Buddhism is a kind of metaphysical monism. And part of what's distinctive about Chan or Zen in particular is that it develops practices for expressing or helping you to realize that everything is one. So what difference does it make whether monism or dualism is true? This is a reproduction of a painting of René Descartes. And philosophers disagree about pretty much everything. But one thing philosophers agree about is that modern philosophy starts with Descartes. He's this really important figure in the rise of modern Western philosophy. And one of the things he's famous for is he's a kind of dualist. So Descartes thinks that fundamentally there are two kinds of things, or he uses a technical term, substance. But what he means by substance is like an independently existing thing. So for Descartes, there are fundamentally two kinds of things that exist. And he uses this technical language. He says, well, there's extended substance, things that have extension. Extension is just a fancy term for occupying space. So there are things that occupy space, and then there are things that think. And he says things that think don't occupy space, and things that occupy space don't think. And so more colloquially, we might say that according to Descartes, there's two kinds of things that exist: body, physical bodies, material things, and mind, or if you want, soul. And so the idea is that your physical body is one kind of thing, and your physical body occupies space and has the properties that physics attributes to it. But your soul or your mind is not the same as your body, and your mind or your soul doesn't occupy space and isn't bound by the rules of physics. So Descartes is a really classic dualist, and his philosophy has a lot of influence even on people who think they're not influenced by Descartes' ideas. In fact, just as a rule of thumb, if you hear someone calling someone else a Cartesian, right? So if you follow the thought of Descartes, you're not a Descartesian, you're a Cartesian. If you find someone calling another philosopher a Cartesian, my experience is that usually the philosophers who call other Cartesians are themselves the most radical Cartesians, just because Descartes' ideas are so influential that people are often following Descartes without even knowing it. But anyway, Descartes got this dualistic philosophy. And so you've got body and you have mind or soul. And so body, material things are studied by sciences like physics, The mind or the soul is the realm of ethics. Pinky, my cat, is down here and just decided to move my screen a little bit. Sorry about that. The body is the role of causal determination. What happens to bodies is determined by causal laws. But the soul is the realm of freedom. The soul is free. The body is responsible for emotions, whereas the soul or mind is a faculty of reason. The body and its emotions can interfere with the mind or the soul if the mind or soul allows them to do so. But if the mind or soul is working properly, it can exercise pure disembodied reason. The body is the realm of sensuality, of sensing things with your eyes, your ears, but also of sensual desires, whereas the mind is responsible for the faculty of rationality. More broadly, the body is associated with what is profane or secular, whereas the soul is associated with what is sacred or religious. The body is not what I am. I am not my body. I am, my I is my soul or my mind. And you think about it, you realize if you accept this dualism, the body is the realm of sex, sexuality, sexual desire, because that's attached to the physical body and embodiment. But true love is about the mind. It's about one soul or one mind loving another soul or mind. And all of these dualisms might lead you, although this last thing Descartes would not say explicitly, but it might lead you to think that, well, I guess the body's associated with everything that's dirty and impure, and the soul is associated with everything that's pure and clean. And so it creates a worldview in which it's very easy to make distinctions and say, well, there's love, which is pure, and then there's sexual desire, which is dirty and attached to the body. And my body is gross and dirty, but my soul is pure and rational and free. And so it gives you a way of your metaphysics ends up influencing how you think about matters of value. And there are philosophers who think that Descartes has really had a lot of influence on how we think about our bodies and ourselves. And I think that's undeniable that he has had that influence. So that's what you get if you have a dualistic picture. But remember, as we've seen so far in the course, when Buddhism comes to China, Buddhism in South Asia and India, one of the key doctrines is anatman, no self. And so they defend the doctrine of no self in original Indian Buddhism. When Buddhism comes to China, they don't believe that there's a self, but the way they interpret that is there's no individual self, but you share a self with other things. Think about Indra's web in Huayan Buddhism, the notion that everything that exists is causally and conceptually connected to everything else. So you get a kind of monistic picture. Well, if you've got a kind of monism, if you drop Descartes' idea that fundamentally reality is dualistic, and this is a Japanese Zen circle drawing, which it's a way of representing the unity of everything in the universe, then all these other dualisms, not just in metaphysics, but in the theory of the self and in ethics, all these other dualisms drop out. And you're left with the idea that, as Huayan puts it, all is one and one is all. So ways of formulating value in the world and ethics that would have made sense to you if you had a dualistic picture are going to be much harder to make sense of if you have a monistic picture. And so that's why the debate between dualistic versus monistic metaphysics actually can have very significant ethical implications as well. Now, one of the Chinese, I forgot something. I was about to go on to China, but so another aspect of this monistic worldview, one of the greatest Indian Buddhist philosophers is Nāgārjuna. And he wrote a fascinating, although also very challenging work defending the view that there is no self. And one of the things that Nāgārjuna argues for is that Nirvana is samsara. Nirvana is samsara. That's a useful phrase to remember. What does that mean, though, if I say Nirvana is samsara? Well, if you remember back when we first were learning about Buddhism, we learned that Nirvana is the ultimate state that you're aiming for in Buddhism. So when you achieve enlightenment, and in early Buddhism, they seem to think of Nirvana as something you achieved after you died. And they also said, I mean, Nirvana is explained in the Questions of King Melinda, which we read earlier in the course. And it says, well, Nirvana is really hard to describe because it's unlike any other state you've been in. It's not like heaven, because you conceive of heaven as a place that your soul, your self, goes after you die. So the conventional notion of heaven requires a dualistic teaching of what the self is. So Nirvana is a positive state, but it's not like any other positive state. Literally, Nirvana means extinguishing, like a flame going out. And metaphorically, Nirvana is like the flame of desire and attachment snuffing out. But descriptions of it are kind of vague, necessarily, because it's not like any other state. Samsara is a term in original Indian philosophy for the illusory world that we experience on a day-to-day basis. So we experience a world of separate independent selves and separate independent things. And that's what gets us involved in clinging to permanence, because we think that we're a separate independent thing, and we attempt to control and own other separate independent things. This illusory world is samsara. It's the world of illusory, separate, independent things when nothing has a self. But Nāgārjuna saw a really interesting implication if you take the doctrine of no self really seriously. He realized, you know what? Nirvana must be samsara. Because if we had a dualistic distinction between nirvana, the ultimate spiritual state, and samsara, the world of illusion, that would be a kind of dualism. And dualism would only make sense if you had a notion of different selves, which had different fundamental categories. So if you have mind and body, you could make sense maybe of the notion of that nirvana and samsara are completely separate. But if you're a monist, you really can't distinguish ultimately between nirvana and samsara. So Nāgārjuna said, nirvana is samsara. What does that mean practically? What that means is enlightenment is simply seeing the everyday world without attachment to the illusion of permanent independent selves. So if you want to know what nirvana looks like, right, I can show you nirvana right now. Open your eyes. This is nirvana. Nirvana is not a separate realm or a separate place you go after you die. Nirvana is this world, but nirvana is this world seen without being stuck in the illusion of attachment to permanent independent selves. So that's what it means to say nirvana is samsara. And although Nāgārjuna comes up with this idea in the Indian Buddhist tradition, it really, catches on in the Chan or Zen tradition. And they start to give this value to ordinary everyday activities and ordinary everyday things, because they realize we're not trying to transcend this world. To try to transcend this world would be a dualistic teaching. We're just trying to see this world in the right way and then act appropriately given our understanding that one is all and all is one. So that's a kind of exciting idea. Now, what does this mean in terms of practical actions? One of the leading Chan philosophers is Linji, and that's his Chinese name, Linji. His Japanese name is Rinzai. So you would pronounce the same characters, Rinzai, in Japanese. And if you remember from the video we saw last week about life in an actual Buddhist monastery, what school was that monastery, or what sect of Zen was that school a part of? It was Rinzai Zen. And the sect of Rinzai Zen is named after this philosopher from Tang Dynasty, China, Linji. And one of the things that Linji said was this. He said, and this is in your textbook, followers of the way, if you want to understand the Dharma, the teachings of the Buddha, do not be fooled by others. Whether you turn inward or outward, whatever you encounter, kill it. If you meet a Buddha, kill the Buddha. If you meet a patriarch, one of the founders, the major figures in the transmission of Buddhism from Bodhidharma, who supposedly first brought the teachings of Chan to China, to the sixth patriarch, whose platform sutra we read before. If you meet a patriarch, kill the patriarch. If you meet an enlightened being, kill the enlightened being. If you meet your parents, kill your parents. If you meet your relatives, kill your relatives. Only then will you find emancipation. And by not clinging to anything, you will be free wherever you go. Now, that was as shocking in Tang Dynasty China as it is today. Like, if you meet the Buddha, kill the Buddha. If you meet your parents, kill your parents. He doesn't mean, of course, literally murder them. What he means, and this is something that students sometimes notice when they're first learning about Buddhism, that Buddhism is about overcoming attachment to things, the illusory attachment to things as if they were permanent, independent entities. But then students sometimes notice, couldn't wanting to be enlightened be an attachment? Couldn't achieving nirvana be a goal that you are attached to? Couldn't the institution of Buddhism be something that you are attached to in the technical sense that you're trying to overcome attachment? Yes, it certainly could. And that's what Linji recognized. So when he says, if you meet the Buddha, kill the Buddha, he means you have to overcome attachment to Buddhism. You have to overcome attachment to the Buddha. You have to overcome attachment to the sutras, the holy teachings, the sacred documents of the tradition. Only then will you find emancipation, and by not clinging to anything, you'll be free wherever you go. By the way, you might hear some annoyed yawning in the background. My French bulldog came in, he's on the floor, and he gets bored when I give Zoom lectures. So you might hear him going, that's what you're hearing in the background. So I think Linji would enjoy that intervention by my bulldog, my French bulldog. So yeah, so if you meet anything that could become an impediment, by becoming an object of attachment, you have to overcome that. And so metaphorically, kill it. Linji also says, do you want to know Buddhas and patriarchs? They are standing before me listening to this lecture. You are Buddhas. You are the patriarchs of the Chan tradition. But you don't have confidence in yourselves, so you run around searching. But even if you find something, it will be nothing but words and phrases, not the living spirit of the patriarchs. So remember, there's nothing that the Buddha had or the Buddha could do that you don't have or you can't do. There's nothing that Linji or Huineng or any of the other Buddhist masters we're going to talk about, nothing they had or they could do that you don't have or that you can't do. Followers of the way simply follow circumstances and fulfill your karma, right? So in other words, do the actions. Karma technically is intentional action. Do the action that's appropriate for you in your circumstance. When it's time to put on your robe, put it on. When you need to travel, walk onward. When you wish to sit down, just sit. And never have a single thought of entering Buddhahood. Because if you're thinking too much about achieving Buddhahood, that's become an attachment and an impediment to achieving enlightenment. Followers of the way, Buddhism requires no special efforts. You have only to lead your everyday life without seeking anything more. Piss and shit, get dressed, eat your rice, and lie down when you're tired. So this emphasis on doing everyday activities, but doing them in a detached kind of way. And detached doesn't mean apathetic. You're focused on what you're doing when you're doing it. So if you're in a lecture, pay attention to the lecture. Don't be surfing on the web while you're listening to a lecture. Or if you're giving a lecture, give the lecture. Don't be thinking about what you have to do later in the day or what other obligations you have. If you're hanging out with your friends to relax, Be in the moment. Only think about hanging out with your friends and having a good time with them. Don't think about the assignments you have later or the pandemic in the world. It's time to put on your mask because you're in a pandemic. Put on your mask. If it's time to take off the mask because you're back in your room, take it off. Is it time to rest? Rest. Is it time to do homework? Do homework. Is it time to eat? Eat. Just be in the moment, whatever you are doing. Why? Because nirvana is samsara. There's nowhere else to go. This is the reality. Be in the moment completely. Now, a fascinating Japanese Zen master, and I've been fascinated with him for a long time, who illustrates some of the practical implications of the monism of the Zen tradition, and this notion that nirvana is samsara, all is one is all, is the Japanese Zen master Ikkyū. And he wrote a wonderful anthology of poetry called the Crazy Cloud Anthology. And he was famous, or you might say infamous, for violating many of the tenets of Buddhist practice because he was an ordained monk. And in most traditions, Buddhist monks and nuns are celibate because sexual attachment is considered such a strong form of attachment that it's almost intrinsically gets in the way of achieving enlightenment. But Ikkyū realized, well, look, if you're really a monist, then you can't make a distinction between sacred and profane, or reason and sex, or spirituality and sensuality. Remember, if you're a Cartesian, you can identify these dualisms in practice because you've got a dualistic metaphysics that can explain why sex has to be inappropriate for a spiritual person, because the soul is the realm of the spiritual and the body, which you're trying to transcend, is the realm of sensuality. But Ikkyū thinks, well, look, if all is one, there's not a fundamental cleavage between, for example, sensuality and spirituality. Sensuality and sexuality can be spiritual if you approach them in the right way. So although Ikkyū was a monk, he was a monk who often went to taverns, bars, we call them, and also went to brothels. So Ikkyū would go to bars, taverns, and brothels, and he had a mistress. And when people criticized him and said, well, how can you get drunk if you're a Zen monk? Or how can you have sex if you're a Zen monk? He'd say, you are stuck in a dualistic way of thinking. And nirvana is samsara. All is one is all. So if you approach these activities in the right way, they don't have to be non-spiritual or unenlightened. And he wrote a lot of poetry collected in the Crazy Cloud Anthology to reflect these views. And this is one he wrote: Ode to the Brothel. Beautiful woman, cloud and rain, love's deep river. Old Zen pavilion monk up in the pavilion singing. I have such refined passion for hugging and kissing. My mind doesn't say, the world is a fire, give up your body. There's so much going on in this poem. Clouds and rain is a classical Chinese way of referring to the sex act. So you could say, they had the clouds and rain. That means they had sex. It's a delicate way of saying they had sex. Love's deep river is, I would say, almost certainly a yonic symbol, I'm sure you've heard the term phallic symbol. The female equivalent of a phallic symbol is a yonic symbol, and love's deep river, I'm pretty sure, is a yonic symbol. The reference to old Zen pavilion monk, there's a story that a Zen monk heard a woman singing a love song, and he achieved enlightenment hearing her sing a love song. And that's an interesting example because you would think that a love song is not the kind of thing that a Zen monk should be interested in. And so it's kind of surprising, but typical of Zen, that this Zen monk achieved enlightenment by hearing her song, and it revealed something about reality to him. So Ikkyū is playing on that, but he's saying, old Zen pavilion monk up in the pavilion singing, he says, I'm the monk singing the song, not achieving enlightenment by hearing the woman sing. I'm the woman who is himself now singing the love song. He says, I have such refined passion for hugging and kissing. Again, not the kind of thing that a Zen monk is supposed to be bragging about. He says, my mind does not say, the world is a fire, give up your body. But some Buddhists would say that. They said the world is a fire. Fire is often a symbol in the sutras for attachment to things, the kind of attachment that leads to the unsatisfactory impermanence of the world. And so you will find Buddhists saying the world is on fire. You have to give up your body. And he says, I'm not going to give up my body. Why? That would be to accept a dualistic teaching. So this was shocking when he wrote it centuries ago. It's still shocking to us now. But Ikkyū is trying to follow out the logical implications of a kind of metaphysical monism and what that implies for ethics. Here's another poem by Ikkyū. I hope you can see on the right there. That's a contemporary photograph of a Japanese Zen monk who is playing a flute with a basket on his head, because why not? And then here's another poem in which Ikkyū describes himself, and he says, praising myself, crazy, crazy man roils up a crazy wind, coming and going between brothels and wine shops. Is there an unblind monk who can test my understanding? Painting south, painting north, painting west and east. And so he describes himself as crazy, but you may know this, the figure of the crazy person in literature, both in Eastern traditions, but also in Western traditions, there's often a view that the crazy person is the one who actually understands. The so-called crazy person is the one who actually understands what's going on in the world, because the world is itself crazy. So you have to seem crazy to the world to actually understand what's going on. And part of the Chan or Zen tradition is that you do iconoclastic crazy things to try to shock people into an awareness of the fact that they're blindly accepting conventions, or just accepting social conventions without reflection, and so failing to see the world as it actually is. One more, this is on the right here, we've got a photograph of a scroll, and it's really interesting because the top part in Chinese characters, Ikkyū has written in his own, we think this could be in his own hand, and that's an image of Ikkyū in the circle on the top, represents, this is it's a representation of Ikkyū, and it's a poem written in his hand. And then on the bottom is an image of Ikkyū's mistress, who is named Mori. And she's got a poem that she composed, but her poem is written in hiragana. And if you're a student of Japanese tradition, it's interesting how the choice to write something in kanji, Chinese text, versus hiragana, which is a Japanese phonetic script, reflects things like gender, but also social status, education level, and things like that. And here's, this is not this poem, but this is a poem that Ikkyū wrote about his mistress. He says, how is my hand like Mori's hand? I have faith that Our Lady is the master of breeze. When I feel bad, she helps my jade stalk sprout, delighting all in my congregation. So there's a story, there's a koan, and we're going to talk about koans more in just a moment. There's a koan that someone is asked, how is your hand like the hand of the Buddha? And so Ikkyū plays on that by saying, how is my hand like my mistress Mori's hand? And he says, I have faith that Our Lady is the master of breeze. And I put breeze in quotation marks because the term he uses here, which is literally the flow of the wind, is almost like a technical term in his poetry. And it can mean different things, but it means being like going with the flow of the breeze, being natural and spontaneous and unconstrained by social convention. And here it also has implications of sensuality. He says, I have faith that Our Lady is the master of breeze. When I feel bad, she helps my jade stalk sprout. And jade stalk is exactly what you think it is. Again, this is a classical Chinese way of referring to a man's penis. And then he says, when I feel bad, she helps my jade stalk sprout, delighting all in my congregation. And congregation, of course, can mean the people, the monks, if you're a master, the monks who are underneath you in the monastery, that's your congregation. But here, his congregation refers to all the parts of his body. And so she makes all parts of me feel great by helping my jade stalk sprout. And again, if it seems really shocking that a Buddhist monk would be writing this appreciative poem about how his mistress is very good at using her hand to pleasure him, Ikkyū would say, if it seems shocking to you, you're stuck in dualistic thinking, because you think that what is sacred is over here and what is profane or bodily is over here. And if you recognize that one is all and all is one, if you recognize that nirvana is samsara, you won't see sexuality as something that is in principle opposed to spirituality. So Ikkyū continues to shock us after all these years. One more anecdote about Ikkyū that I just love. In the time that Ikkyū lived, and we'll see something similar happened in China, the thing is that for good philosophical and spiritual reasons, Buddhism becomes a very influential force in both China and Japan, and then also Korea, Vietnam. But it becomes, and because Buddhism is a fascinating philosophical and spiritual tradition, it's entirely appropriate that people get interested in it. But what happens as it becomes institutionalized is that Buddhism starts to be kind of corrupted, because eventually you can make a lot of wealth and have a lot of political power by being a leading Zen monk. And as Zen becomes institutionalized, you get things like a certificate of enlightenment. And so you're issued an actual certificate saying, I am enlightened. Here's this guy who himself has a certificate of enlightenment, and he stamped my form showing that I'm enlightened. So Ikkyū's master gave Ikkyū this certificate of enlightenment, and Ikkyū said, no, it's okay, I don't want it. Because Ikkyū realized that if you're really enlightened, you don't need a certificate to show that. And he realized people were really attached in the technical sense to these certificates of enlightenment, because they gave you social cachet and power and prestige. And so he rejected it. And Ikkyū's master, gave it the certificate to someone else to store for Ikkyū and said, yeah, he'll want this later. But then when someone later reproduced the certificate of enlightenment, Ikkyū burned his certificate of enlightenment in front of witnesses and said, look, no, I'm destroying it. I don't want it. I don't want it. And that rejection of the social trappings of the status of being an enlightened monk was very characteristic of Ikkyū. I think it's also characteristic of the true meaning of Zen, because the idea is, look, if I'm attached to this certificate of enlightenment, I'm still attached and I haven't achieved enlightenment yet. One last story about Ikkyū. Ikkyū, as I said, his master declared him enlightened. And the way it went was Ikkyū expressed his understanding of a koan, and the master said, that's very good, but you just achieved the level of an arhat, which is not the highest level of an actual bodhisattva or master. And we talked about arhats versus bodhisattvas in our introductory lecture on Buddhism. And so Ikkyū's master said, that's good interpretation, but you're just at the level of an arhat. You're not really a master yet. And Ikkyū said, oh, I don't want to be a master. I hate masters. And his master said, oh, well, in that case, you are a master. Congratulations. So by rejecting attachment to becoming a master, Ikkyū had shown that he was unattached, and therefore his master said, well, that's it, you've achieved enlightenment. So Ikkyū is a really fascinating figure. And he also, we'll talk about this a little bit in passing later, he also had a lot of influence on the development of fine arts in Japan. So there's a lot you can learn about Ikkyū. Now, in order to understand a little better what the significance of Zen is, you need to recognize that part of Zen is finding practices that both express enlightenment, but also help to induce enlightenment. And you can certainly find antecedents of this in the earlier Indian tradition of Buddhism. But one of the things that happened when Buddhism came to China was that people thought there were some interesting similarities between Buddhism and Daoism. And I showed you a painting showing Confucius and the Buddha and Lao Tzu, the supposed founder of Daoism, representing the view that some people had that ultimately all three of these teachings were in harmony. Some people even believed that Lao Tzu actually was the Buddha, that the Buddha in India was Lao Tzu, because it said that Lao Tzu got tired of China, and so he got on the back of an ox and took a trip out to the west, and supposedly he went all the way to India and became the Buddha. Historically, that's not accurate, but there were people who thought that, reflecting the similarities they saw between Daoism and Buddhism. So Zhuangzi is probably, in many people's opinion, including mine, the greatest Taoist philosopher. And at the risk of oversimplification, you might say that Zhuangzi's brand of Taoism plus Buddhism is what gave rise to Zen. And I'm going to give you a couple quotations from the writings of Zhuangzi, which are just called the Zhuangzi, they're named after him, to illustrate these similarities and influences of Zhuangzi's brand of Taoism, this indigenous Chinese system of thought, on what became Chan or Zen Buddhism in China and then later Japan. So in the Zhuangzi, you have what purports to be a dialogue between Confucius, Kōans, and a disciple whom Confucius identified as his greatest disciple, Yan Hui. It's not an actual historical exchange, but it's presented as one. And in this exchange, Kōans is giving advice to Yan Hui, and he tells him, Confucius says to his disciple Yan Hui, "You must fast." And Yan Hui said, "My family is poor. Indeed, I have not drunk wine or eaten any meat for months. Can this be considered fasting?" Confucius replies, "That is the fasting one does before a ritual sacrifice, not the fasting of the mind." And Yan Hui says, "May I ask about the fasting of the mind?" He says, "Unify your intentions. Don't listen with your ears, but listen with your mind. No, don't listen with your mind, but listen with your chi." This sort of like underlying fluid which is connected to our emotions and our motivations. Listening stops with the ear, the mind stops with signs. Chi is empty and waits on external things. Only the way gathers in emptiness. Emptiness is the fasting of the mind. Yan Hui replied, "Prior to receiving this instruction, I was full of thoughts of Hui." He's referring to himself. In both Chinese and Japanese, it's not considered weird to refer to yourself by your personal name. So in Chinese or Japanese, I could say, "Well, Brian thinks," and that doesn't sound as weird as it does in English. So prior to receiving this instruction, I was full of thoughts of Hui, of myself. But having applied it, it's as though Hui, I, never existed. Is this what you mean by emptiness? And Confucius replied, "Perfect." So what we see here is a recommendation to fast your mind, to empty out your mind of your preconceptions, your desires, your attachments. And when you do that, you let go of the notion of the self. And this was part of the Chinese tradition prior to the arrival of Buddhism, which happened centuries after the death of Zhuangzi. But when people, having read Zhuangzi, learned about Buddhism, they said, wow, these ideas of getting rid of yourself are really similar. Now, just a footnote here, I think the Zhuangzi view isn't the same as the Buddhist view. The Buddhist view is that you don't have a self. You think you have a self. What you have to come to realize is you don't have a self, and recognizing that neither you nor anyone else has an individual self is enlightenment. Zhuangzi's view, I think, is you've got a self. Most of us have a self, but the self is actually not benefiting us. The self is the source of distortion and misunderstanding and suffering. So we have to get rid of ourself. So it's kind of like, it's a subtle difference, but it's the difference between, say, thinking that you have a block of wood and you've got to empty out the center of the block of wood, which is more like Zhuangzi's view, versus the Buddhist view, which is like, well, you've got an egg and you don't know that that the inside of the egg is empty. It's a wind egg. There's nothing inside the egg, and there's nothing really there. So, but practically speaking, in terms of what they recommend, these doctrines are pretty similar. So this is one of the reasons that Chinese Buddhists were really excited about the similarities they saw to Zhuangzi's ideas. So this led to Zhuangzi's particular version of Daoism having an influence on how Buddhism developed in China. In particular, one of the most influential ideas in Zhuangzi is that it is in practical activities that you can express enlightenment and even achieve enlightenment. So, for example, this is another passage in the Zhuangzi. A butcher was cutting up an ox for Lord Wenhui. Wherever his hand touched, wherever his shoulder leaned, wherever his foot stepped, wherever his knee pushed, with a zip, with a whoosh, he handled his chopper with aplomb and never skipped a beat. He moved in time to the dance of the mulberry forest and harmonized with the head of the line symphony. Lord Wenhui said, "Ah, excellent, that technique can reach such heights." So he's really impressed with how well this butcher is carving up this ox. But the butcher responds, he sheathed his chopper and responded, "What your servant, what I care about is the way, which goes beyond technique. When I first began cutting up oxen, I did not see anything but oxen. 3 years later, I couldn't see the whole ox. And now I encounter them with spirit and don't look with my eyes. Sensible knowledge stops and spiritual desires proceed. I rely on the heavenly patterns, Tianli, strike in the big gaps, am guided by the large fissures, and follow what is inherently so. I never touch a ligament or tendon, much less do any heavy wrenching." So notice this phrase, heavenly patterns, Tianli. We talked in a previous lecture about Indra's net or Indra's web, which is a metaphor for representing the way that everything in the universe is interconnected with everything else. The term the Chinese Buddhists use to describe the pattern of Indra's web is Li, this term here. And so the butcher is saying that he follows the natural pattern of the ox as he cuts it up. And doing that is not just a matter of technique, although it is an impressive technique. You're really in touch with the way of the universe, when you're following the heavenly pattern of the ox as you skillfully dismember it. And Lord Wenhui said, "Excellent. I've heard the words of a butcher and learned how to care for life." So this isn't just a lesson about carving up an ox, it's a lesson about how to live in general. So this, again, there were antecedents to this idea in the Indian tradition, like especially like works like the Vimalakirti Sutra had a lot of influence, which is an Indian work, had a lot of influence on the development of Chan and Zen in East Asia. But Zhuangzi's notion that it's in practical activities, even an everyday activity like carving up an ox, which would have been considered very low class by most Confucians, this can express and cultivate an enlightened state, because when you do it, you're in touch with the pattern of the world and you've given up the distinction between yourself and others. So think about something like when you're really focused on playing a musical instrument, or you're really focused on doing art, whether it's painting or sculpture or whatever you might do, when you're really doing something like playing a musical instrument or doing calligraphy well, you lose your sense of self. You lose yourself in the activity. Right? And the Chan masters said, yeah, that's right. We can help people to realize they don't have a self by losing the notion of the self in practical activities. So this had a significant influence on how Zen developed. And so this is a book where we're not reading it in this course, but I recommend it, Zen in the Art of Archery by Eugen Herrigel. And it's about a German philosopher who went to Japan and he wanted to learn about Zen. So he studied under an archery master. As I recall, it's been years since I read this, but as I recall, he says, well, I know how to shoot a rifle, so I figured that would help in doing Zen archery. And he says, I later learned that was a mistake. But the idea is that in a practical activity like shooting a bow and arrow in the right meditative state of mind, you express and cultivate your enlightenment. That is a notion you get in Chan or Zen Buddhism, and it ultimately comes from the influence of Zhuangzi's Taoist ideal on the development of Buddhism in China. So again, Zhuangzi's brand of Taoism plus Buddhism equals Zen Buddhism. That's a grotesque oversimplification, but sometimes it's useful to have these little oversimplifications to hang our hat on. And Zen in the Art of Archery was translated into English and sold millions of copies. It's still worth reading. I'd recommend it. But it also influenced a lot of other works. So a bestseller I believe in the 70s was Zen and the Art of Motorcycle Maintenance by Robert Pirsig. And that's one of the works that first got me excited about philosophy. Now, in fairness, in retrospect, Zen and the Art of Motorcycle Maintenance is not a deep work of philosophy, but it is a fun work of philosophy. And you could get some insights by reading it, although at the end of the day, there are deeper things to read. But there's actually, like I'm saying, a whole genre of works, Zen and the Art of Motorcycle Maintenance being one of them, inspired broadly by this book, Zen in the Art of Archery. So part of what I'm saying is that the Chan or Zen tradition, I'm just going to call it Zen because that's usually what we call it in English for various historical reasons, developed techniques for helping you to cultivate an awareness that one is all and all is one, and also to express your enlightenment experience of the unity of everything. Now, of course, the Eightfold Path, the ethical teachings of Buddhism, which we talked about in the first lecture on Buddhism, that certainly plays a role. Studying the teachings of the Buddhist tradition, like the essay on the Golden Lion and the Rafter Dialogue and the teachings of Linji, these were in the Platform Sutra of the Sixth Patriarch, these also have a role. As we saw in the video we watched last week, meditation, and particularly seated meditation, Zazen, has a role to play. But as all the Zen masters emphasize, if when you're seated in meditation, when you're doing Zazen, you feel like you're enlightened, but then when you get up and you start to do something practical, you feel like you've lost the enlightenment experience, they're going to say, then you weren't really enlightened when you were seated in meditation either. Because again, to think, well, I'm enlightened when I'm doing Zazen, I'm not enlightened when I'm doing homework, or Ikkyū would say, making love, that is to accept a dualistic teaching. But if you're trying to achieve enlightenment, seated meditation is one of the techniques you can use. We also saw in the video that Dokusan, meeting with a Zen master to discuss your spiritual progress or to discuss a koan you're working on, is another technique for helping to cultivate enlightenment. Chores, every serious Zen practice I've ever heard of, doing chores can be part of achieving enlightenment. Again, doing something like cleaning the kitchen or cleaning your room. you have to do it in a mindful way, where if you're trying to clean, but you're thinking about the homework or the essay you have to write later, or you're thinking about the pandemic while you're reading a book, that is not being in the moment and achieving the mindfulness that you want to have in every moment. But just doing chores can help, if you're really focused on it, overcome your attachment to yourself. The fine arts, calligraphy, can be an expression of enlightenment or a way of cultivating it. Because again, when you're doing calligraphy, I've practiced a little bit of calligraphy, although my calligraphy is terrible. But when you're doing it well, you lose yourself in the activity. Or painting, brush painting can be an artistic activity in which you lose yourself. The tea ceremony, the Japanese tea ceremony, is an artistic activity in which you can lose yourself. And all these things, when you're completely mindful of what you're doing, the idea is you lose touch with your preoccupations of yourself. And so you can come into contact with the heavenly pattern, the natural pattern of the universe. And then I'm going to emphasize in the remainder of the lecture 2 ways in which you can express and cultivate enlightenment in the martial arts and in a koan. So we'll talk about each of those a bit more. Interestingly, there's a saying in both Japanese and Chinese that goes something like, the way of the brush and the way of the sword are one. Brush means the calligraphy or painting brush, and the sword, of course, means the sword that you would use if you're a samurai or in combat. And the saying is, the way of the sword and the way of the brush are one. What does that mean? It means that, it means several different things, but one of the things it means is that ultimately the goal of calligraphy and the goal of swordsmanship is to let go of the notion of the self and to overcome the illusory attachments to things that we have because of the illusory notion of individual selves. So you want to lose yourself in swordsmanship, lose yourself in calligraphy. One of my favorite modern Chinese films is Hero by Zhang Yimou, Yingxiong in Chinese. And there's a great scene in it, you could find it on YouTube, where a calligraphy school is being attacked. And it's defended by this great swordsman who has come to the calligraphy school to study calligraphy because he knows he can discover the secret to defeating his opponent by watching his opponent do calligraphy, because the way of the brush and the way of the sword are one. So it's a fun film. But let's look a little bit more at the way in which, if you perform martial arts in the right way, they're actually a practical technique for expressing and cultivating a monistic worldview, a worldview in which there is no other and self, and a worldview in which you lose yourself in the activity. Now, another thing, I mentioned Per-Sig Zen and the Art of Motorcycle Maintenance is something that got me into philosophy. Another thing, to be really honest, that got me into East Asian philosophy was the Kung Fu craze, the martial arts craze in the West in the 70s. And a seminal event in this was Bruce Lee's film, Enter the Dragon, which became a surprise hit in the Western world. And this goes back to the fact, like, why is Van Norden starting out by showing us an image of Bruce Lee? And while you were getting seated, I was playing Carl Douglas's Kung Fu Fighting, which was a big hit in the 70s. Well, it's because there actually is a serious philosophical connection between the Zen tradition and the martial arts. And Bruce Lee, the star of Enter the Dragon, and a person who had this huge effect in bringing knowledge of East Asian martial arts and respect to East Asian martial arts to the contemporary West, studied philosophy. And he was actually, I don't think he completed the degree, but he was very seriously interested in philosophy. And we can see Bruce Lee's interest in philosophy and the influence of Zen ideals here in this brief scene from Enter the Dragon from 1973. So please enjoy watching this with me.
Teacher?
I see your talents have gone beyond the mere physical level.
Your skills are now at the point of spiritual insight. I have several questions. What is the highest technique you hope to achieve?
To have no technique.
Very good. What are your thoughts when facing an opponent?
There is no opponent.
And why is that?
Because the word I does not exist.
So, continue.
A good fight should be like a small play, but played seriously. A good martial artist does not become tense, but ready. Not thinking, yet not dreaming. Ready for whatever may come. When the opponent expands, I contract. When it contracts, I expand. And when there is an opportunity, I do not hit. It hits all by itself.
So he's actually using correctly and appropriately concepts from Chan Buddhism to explain how to be a great martial artist. And interestingly, I'll just mention this as a side note here. There's a great essay, that I would recommend to you by Kamau Bell, who's a journalist. I think he's with CNN. And I ran across this recently. The essay, it's on Medium. Me and Bruce Lee would like to have a word with you. I'll add the link to our syllabus page on Moodle. And if you're watching this on YouTube, I'll add a link to it in the description. It's a great essay. And one of the things that Bell points out is that many African Americans, when Bruce Lee's films became popular in the US, many African Americans really identified with Bruce Lee and with China, because part of what Bruce Lee expresses in his films is the way that the Chinese people were victimized by Western powers, and at a certain point in history by Japan as well. And so the plight at certain points in history of Chinese Americans was something that many African Americans like Mr. Bell identified with. And people like, the fact that many African Americans learned Kung Fu because they identified with the plight of Chinese Americans at a certain point of history was a real phenomenon. And Bell's got this great essay discussing this background, but also discussing the unfortunate fact that sometimes these ethnic groups lose touch with the common cause they had at a certain point in history. And he's calling on people to have greater understanding for the ways in which they faced similar kinds of things and should be allies rather than enemies. So it's an interesting essay. Now, another major distinctive feature of Chan Buddhism is the Kōan, or in Chinese, it's Gong'an, which just means like public case. The most famous Kōan is by the Japanese Zen master Hakuin, "What is the sound of one hand clapping?" And you should just recognize that reference. That's a reference to this famous Kōan. And the thing about Kōans is you can typically interpret them intellectually. And I'm really good, I think, at interpreting Kōans intellectually. But the thing is, I know, because I've done this in part, that if I was in a dokusan and I went to a Zen master and I said, okay, here's my interpretation of the Kōan, it's not that my interpretation would be wrong, but they would say, you're not enlightened yet. You're making progress, but you're not enlightened. Why? Koans aren't about the intellectual answer you give. They're about getting you to see the world in a different way. And the true Zen master can tell by the way in which you answer the koan, not the words you use, not the intellectual content of the answer, but the way in which you answer whether you are enlightened. So two people might utter the exact same words in the dokusan, in the one-on-one meeting between the disciple and the master. They might say exactly the same words, but the master will say of one person, very good, you're enlightened. And they might say of the other person, you're not enlightened. Because it's not the intellectual content, it's the way in which you relate to the world, which is expressed in your posture, your facial expression, your tone of voice, and the process by which you got there. So I'm going to give you interpretations of these koans, but again, the interpretations by themselves don't make you enlightened. What is the sound of one hand clapping? Well, the point is you need two hands to clap. But then you say, okay, so what's the point of that? Well, one of anything isn't anything. Not just in the case of clapping hands, but in an earlier lecture, as I said, if I ask, what am I? Van Norden is a teacher, but I'm a teacher because of you. I am a son because of my parents. I am a father because of my children. I am an employee because of Vassar College. So these things, my parents, my children, you, Vassar College, those are the other hand to my hand, and you need both to make the clap. One of my friends in graduate school said, what is the sound of one hand clapping? Wouldn't it be swish, swish, swish? Which, again, depending on where you're at in your enlightenment, that might be a better answer. But so here's a koan. Master Dongshan was asked by a monk, what is Buddha? Dongshan replied, 3 pounds of flax. A monk asked, what is Buddha? Master Yunmen replied, a dried shit stick. Pardon my language, but that's what it says. What is a shit stick? It's what people used before toilet paper. Toilet paper actually was invented in China, I believe later in the Tang Dynasty, but prior to that, people would use a stick to clean themselves after defecating. And so what's the point of this? Well, again, if all is one and one is all, if you ask what the Buddha is everything. So the Buddha is just something like, flax, or the Buddha is even in something as low as just poop or a used piece of toilet paper. That is the Buddha, because all is one is all. And here too, interestingly, we see the influence of Zhuangzi, because the Zhuangzi is a work that is, like Zen Buddhism, often iconoclastic and intentionally humorous and shocking. So in the Zhuangzi, Master East Wall asked Zhuangzi, where is this so-called way, the Tao? Zhuangzi said, there's nowhere it isn't. Well, you must be more specific. It's in an ant. How about even lower? It's in the grass. How about lower still? In tiles. How about even lower than that? It's in dung and urine, okay? And so this like iconoclastic, humorous, shocking style of teaching, trying to shock you out of conventional ways of thinking by making you think through these riddles or puzzles, is a technique that, again, we see foreshadowed in the Zhuangzi. It's, again, another way in which Zhuangzi's Daoism had an influence on the form that Buddhism ultimately took. And like I say, you can interpret the koans, and I'll give you some more koans and interpretations, but it's really the way in which you answer, and the Zen master can see that. So a monk asked, what is myself? Master Zhuangzi said, well, do you see the oak tree in the front garden? How is the oak tree in the front garden myself? All is one and one is all. Ultimately, I'm not here if the oak tree isn't here, because we're part of the same causal nexus that got us here. Nanchuan said, to seek is to deviate. And his disciple, Zhuangzi, said, if I do not seek, how can I know about the way? And this is an interesting paradox, right? Because you're supposed to seek the way, the Dharma. But if you seek it, it can become an attachment. And if it's an attachment, it's something that blocks you from achieving enlightenment. Nanchuan said, the way does not belong to knowing or not knowing. To know is to have a concept. To not know is to be ignorant. If you truly realize the way of no doubt, it is just like the sky, wide open, vast emptiness. How can you say yes or no to it? So even describing what it is to know the way, if you say that you could know it, well, our knowledge is usually mediated by concepts, but a concept is going to limit things. So knowing the way can't be a matter of knowing, but then it can't be ignorance either, because then there wouldn't be anything to know. So the way does not belong to knowing or not knowing. It's just like the sky, which is just there, wide open and vast. At these words, Jiao had sudden enlightenment. His mind became clear like the moon. And this is a nice example of a disciple actually achieving enlightenment. A monk asked, "What is Buddha?" Master Jiao said, "Are you not Buddha?" Yeah, if all is one and one is all, you are the Buddha. A monk asked, "What is myself?" Master Jiao said, "Have you eaten breakfast or not?" The monk said, "I have eaten." Jiao said, "Then wash out your bowls." So this notion that if you want to find your true self, don't go looking somewhere else. You will find your true self in doing everyday activities without obsessing about anxieties or what you have to do later or how other people are viewing you. Just do your daily activities and be in the moment while you do them. That's how you discover your true self, because your true self is the bowls that you're washing out. Now, interestingly, a koan can also be an action. It doesn't have to just be a verbal puzzle. So Master Linji, again, this is in Japanese known as Rinzai, founder of the Rinzai sect. And Ikkyū, by the way, whom I mentioned earlier, was a Rinzai monk, taught monks, don't be afraid of giving up your bodies and sacrificing your lives for the sake of Buddhism. 20 years ago, when I was at Master Huangpo's place, I asked him about the essence of Buddhism 3 times. And 3 times he was kind enough to hit me with his stick. Remember the stick that they use to wake you up in the monastery when you're starting to go to sleep during meditation? But it was as though he had touched me lightly with a branch of mugwort. Mugwort's a medicinal herb. Remembering this, I would like the favor of the stick again. Is there anyone who can give me a good smack? One of the monks stepped forward and said, "I can do it." Linji held out his stick to him, but as the monk was getting ready to grasp it, Linji whacked him. That too is a koan. And the idea is the shocking action is supposed to shock you out of conventional ways of thinking so you see the world as it is. Now, ironically, when you see the world as it is, in many ways, you're going to go back to conventional action because Nirvana is samsara. But they're trying to shock you out of thinking that the ways you ordinarily think, which seem compulsive to you, are the only ways to see the world. Now, gradually, what happens sometimes in the Zen tradition is it gets kind of shocking and sometimes maybe even inappropriate. So when the monks of the Western and Eastern halls were quarreling over a cat, right? So again, they're monks, but they're arguing, is it our cat? Is it your cat? Whose cat is it? Oh, we get to feed the cat. No, we get to feed the cat. I get to pet the cat. No, it's my turn to pet the cat. Master Nāgārjuna held it up and said, "If you are able to speak, I will spare it. If you cannot speak, I will kill it." So in other words, say something to save this cat, but don't just say, "It's my cat," because then you will have shown that you're not enlightened. Say something that shows that you're enlightened. No one could answer, so Nāgārjuna proceeded to kill the cat. He probably really did kill the cat. And that's probably not a metaphor, right? And as a cat lover, I got a cat sitting underneath my my thing that's holding up my laptop here. You know, it's kind of nasty. That evening, Jiao returned from afar, and Nāgārjuna told him what had happened. Jiao took off one sandal, put it on his head, and left. Nāgārjuna said, "If you had been there, you would have saved the cat." So this wordless demonstration of his enlightenment by a nonsensical action would have saved the cat. It's an interesting story, but also the cat did die in the making of this koan. The first patriarch, that was Bodhidharma, who supposedly brought Chan from India to China. The first patriarch sat facing the wall. He was meditating, and he would not accept Hui Ke, who later became, I think, the second patriarch, as his disciple. Hui Ke stood all night in the snow and then cut off his own arm. And he did this as an offering to the first patriarch to prove his dedication. So finally, after Hui Ke cut off his own arm as an offering, the first patriarch then allowed him to ask a question. Hui Ke said, "Your disciple's mind is not at rest. I beg you, master, give it peace." The first patriarch replied, "Bring me your mind and I will give it peace." Hui Ke said, "I have searched for my mind, but I cannot find it." The first patriarch answered, "Then I have given peace to your mind." again, seems kind of nonsensical, but it's an interesting point. If someone says, look, help bring peace to my mind, and he says, okay, give me your mind. Well, of course, that's nonsensical, but the point is, look, I can't give peace to your mind because you can't take it out of your whatever and give it to me. And the guy says, well, I can't find my mind. He says, perfect. That's what we're looking for, is the state where you can no longer find your mind, where you no longer suffer from the illusion that you've got a mind and it's separate. Now, this is probably supposed to be understood as a metaphor, but it does advocate self-mutilation. And part of what happens in the Chinese Buddhist tradition is that people actually start damaging their bodies, cutting off parts of flesh, burning their flesh, literally immolating themselves, damaging their bodies to show their dedication to the Buddha and to show their transcendence of attachment to the illusion of the self. And also the institutions of Buddhism begin to be corrupted by wealth and power. And these kinds of institutional decay eventually lead to the Neo-Confucian reaction against Buddhism, because the Confucians point out accurately, in fairness, that Buddhist institutions had become corrupt. And the Confucians trace this corruption in the Buddhist tradition to the very core of the Buddhist teachings. And so this is the part where, beginning in my next lecture, we're going to start talking about the rise of the Neo-Confucian response to Buddhism, and this movement, which, although it's a Confucian rejection of Buddhism, in many ways is very influenced by Buddhism. As we'll see in later lectures, Neo-Confucianism is Confucianism seen through Buddhist lenses. Thank you for listening. I'll see you next time.